My name is Lily, and I've always felt more comfortable talking to stars than to people. Seriously. If you put me in a room full of strangers, my brain immediately starts calculating the escape routes, checking for fire exits, and wondering if I can somehow blend into the wallpaper. But put me under a vast, inky black sky, with nothing but the whisper of the wind and the ancient light of distant galaxies, and I'm perfectly at home. My shyness isn't just a preference for quiet, it's a full-body experience. My palms get sweaty, my throat closes up, and my thoughts, which are usually a swirling nebula of cosmic data and existential questions, vanish into a silent black hole. It's frustrating because I have a lot to say, especially about the universe. I just can't seem to say it out loud to anyone who has a pulse. I live in a small, dusty town on the edge of the desert, which, for an amateur astronomer like me, is basically paradise. The light pollution is minimal, and the nights are incredibly clear. My setup isn't fancy, just a used but reliable telescope, a beat-up camping chair, and more star charts than I probably need. Most nights, after my shift at the local library, where I spend my days organizing books and avoiding eye contact, I pack up my gear and drive out to my favorite spot, a lonely, flat stretch of land about 20 minutes outside of town. There, under the magnificent expanse of the cosmos, I feel like I finally breathe. It's just me and the universe doesn't ask awkward questions or judge my mumbled responses. My passion for astronomy started when I was a kid. I found an old book about constellations in my grandfather's attic, and from that moment on, I was hooked. The idea that there were billions of worlds out there, stretching further than the eye could see, made my own small, scary world feel a little less intimidating. I devoured every book I could find, taught myself how to use a telescope, and even built a small, rudimentary observatory in my backyard. My dream, if I ever dared to speak it out loud, was to discover something new. Something that would add a tiny piece to the infinite puzzle of the cosmos. But the speaking out loud part was always the catch. I've had a few minor observations over the years, a fleeting meteor shower, an unusual alignment of planets, but nothing major enough to warrant contacting a professional observatory. The thought alone would send shivers down my spine. The idea of talking to actual scientists, people with PhDs and important-sounding titles, made my stomach churn. I imagined them dismissing me as just some amateur girl with a toy telescope, laughing at my findings, or worse, making me explain my data in front of a conference of brilliant minds. So, I kept my notes meticulous, my observations accurate, and my mouth firmly shut. My discoveries were for me and the stars, and that was enough, or so I told myself. My routine was simple and comforting, library by day, desert by night. It was a perfectly constructed little world designed to keep me safe from the terrifying unpredictability of human interaction. My only confidant was Professor Davies, an elderly, retired astrophysicist who occasionally visited the library to read obscure journals. He had a kind, crinkly smile and a gentle way of listening that didn't make me feel like I was under interrogation. I would sometimes leave my handwritten notes on the astronomy shelf, knowing he would find them and leave a small, encouraging comment in the margins. It was our own silent conversation, a perfect arrangement for two people who understood the power of unspoken communication. But even that was a stretch for my comfort zone. Then came that Tuesday night. The air was unusually still, and the sky was a velvet tapestry embroidered with diamonds. I had my telescope pointed at a relatively obscure patch of sky, just outside the known path of a minor meteoroid stream. I was looking for faint, variable stars, a pet project I'd been working on. I adjusted the focus, my eye pressed against the eyepiece, lost in the shimmering expanse. And then I saw it. A faint, fuzzy patch of light, moving steadily against the fixed background of stars. It was too fast for a galaxy, too slow for a meteor. It had a faint tail. It was a comet. But not just any comet. This one was bright, distinct, and it definitely wasn't on any of my star charts or in any of the databases I meticulously cross-referenced. My heart actually skipped a beat. This was new. This was different. This was big. I spent the next few hours meticulously documenting everything. I took precise coordinates, noted its apparent magnitude, estimated its trajectory over the few hours I observed it. I even managed to snap a few blurry but definitive photos through my telescope's eyepiece with my phone camera. My heart was still racing, a mix of exhilaration and dread swirling inside me. This wasn't just a pet project anymore. This was a potential major scientific discovery. I kept whispering to myself, "You found a comet, Lily." A comet. It felt surreal, like something out of a dream. But the reality of having to share this dream with the terrifying waking world of actual human beings was looming over me like a dark cloud. A discovery like this couldn't be kept to myself. A new comet, especially one that was relatively bright and close, was a significant event. It needed to be reported. It needed to be verified by professional observatories. My mind immediately went to the process, contacting an actual astronomical institution, explaining my findings, submitting my coordinates and observations. I imagined talking on the phone, my voice cracking, stumbling over technical terms, probably sounding like a complete amateur to some renowned astrophysicist. The thought alone made my hands go cold. The universe had just handed me the greatest gift, and my own shyness was threatening to turn it into a terrifying burden. The drive home from the desert was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Usually, I enjoy the transition, the way the silence of the dunes slowly gives way to the flickering streetlights of town, but tonight, my car felt like a pressure cooker. My discovery was sitting in the passenger seat, tucked inside my messy notebook, and it felt heavy, like I was transporting a live wire. I kept glancing at the notebook, half expecting the coordinates to vanish or turn into gibberish. I kept telling myself, "Lily, you're an amateur. You probably saw a satellite or a reflection from a high-altitude balloon." But the deep, logical part of my brain, the part that had memorized the position of every major celestial object, knew exactly what I had seen. It was a visitor from the Oort cloud, and I was the only person on Earth who knew it was here. When I finally reached my small apartment, I didn't even take off my coat. I went straight to my desk and flipped open my laptop. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely type my password. I needed to be sure. I logged into the Minor Planet Center's database and cross-referenced the coordinates for the 10th time. Nothing. I checked the latest circulars from the International Astronomical Union. Nothing. The sky was officially empty in that specific sector. My heart did a slow, painful somersault against my ribs. This was it. The moment of truth. I opened a new browser tab and searched for how to report a new comet discovery. The instructions were clear, professional, and utterly terrifying. There was a specific format for the data, a specific email address, and a list of requirements that felt like an entrance exam for a club I wasn't cool enough to join. Provide precise astrometry, include observer details, state equipment used. My eyes blurred as I read the words. Observer details. That meant me. Lily Evans. The girl who hides in the library stacks. The girl who hasn't made eye contact with her neighbor in 3 years. If I sent this data, I wouldn't be invisible anymore. I spent the next 3 hours in a state of hyper-focused panic. I cleaned up my notes, double-checked my calculations using 3 different methods, and even tried to enhance the grainy photos I'd taken with my phone through the eyepiece. They weren't great, but you could clearly see the coma, that fuzzy, ethereal envelope of gas and dust that separates a comet from a boring old asteroid. Every time I reached for the compose button on my email, I pulled back. My shyness wasn't just a quiet voice, it was a physical wall. It whispered to me, "What if you're wrong? What if they laugh at you? What if they reply and ask to do a video call?" That last thought was the worst. I imagined a stern-faced scientist on a screen asking, Me complicated questions while I sat there, frozen and stuttering, with my laundry drying in the background. I could almost feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the way it always does when the spotlight is on me. I closed my laptop and walked to the window. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, turning the desert sky into a bruise-colored purple. I thought about the comet out there, hurtling through the vacuum, cold and ancient. It had traveled billions of miles just to be seen, and here I was, too afraid to hit a button. "It's not about you, Lily," I whispered to the empty room. "It's about the science." It's a trick I try to play on myself sometimes, trying to pretend I don't exist so I can get things done. I went back to the desk, opened the laptop, and stared at the draft. I had written it very formally, leaving out any hint of my personality. I didn't mention that I discovered it while sitting in a folding chair eating a granola bar. I just presented the numbers. Right ascension, for hours 22 minutes and 15 seconds. Declination, plus 15 degrees 31 minutes 2 seconds. I took a deep breath, held it until my chest felt like it might burst, and clicked send. The silence that followed was deafening. I expected something to happen immediately, a siren, a flash of light, an instant reply, but nothing happened. Just the hum of my refrigerator and the distant sound of a neighbor's car starting up. I collapsed onto my bed, still wearing my hiking boots, and fell into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of giant, icy rocks chasing me through library aisles. The words "need additional observations" immediately danced before my eyes like fireflies. My first instinct wasn't triumph. It was a desperate, clawing urge to delete my email account and throw my laptop into the nearest canyon. They wanted more. They wanted me to do more. The "we" in their email, "we would appreciate if you could confirm," felt like a giant hand reaching out of the screen, pulling me out of my safe, quiet corner and into the blinding light of the professional world. I spent the rest of the day at the library in a state of high-functioning catatonia. I moved through the aisles like a ghost, shelving books on autopilot. Every time the phone rang at the front desk, I jumped nearly a foot in the air, terrified it was a scientist calling to grill me on my focal length. My boss, Mrs. Gable, a woman who smelled permanently of peppermint and old paper, squinted at me over her bifocals. "Lily, dear, you're putting the cookbooks in the biography section. Is everything quite all right?" I mumbled something about a headache and scurried away, my face burning. Even in a building full of "quiet please" signs, I felt like I was being too loud just by existing with this secret. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the anxiety shifted. It turned from a cold weight into a buzzing energy. The sky was clear, painfully, beautifully clear. The universe was giving me a window, and I knew that if I didn't take it, I would never forgive myself. I stopped at the grocery store on the way out of town, ducking my head to avoid eye contact with the cashier. I bought a large thermos of coffee and a pack of batteries, moving with the hurried efficiency of someone trying to escape a crime scene. By 8 p.m., I was back at my spot in the desert. The silence here was different than the silence in the library. In the library, silence is a rule you have to follow. Out here, silence is a vast, open ocean that you get to swim in. I set up my telescope with trembling fingers. The air was colder tonight, a sharp, biting wind whipping across the sand, but I didn't care. I aligned the scope, dialed in the coordinates from my notes, and held my breath. There it was. It had moved exactly where my calculations predicted it would be. It looked brighter tonight, the coma more pronounced, a beautiful, ghostly veil of light trailing behind it. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated joy that momentarily pushed the shyness aside. I spent hours taking measurements, recording the exact time of each observation down to the second. I was no longer just Lily, the girl who couldn't order a pizza without rehearsing the conversation for 10 minutes. I was a witness to a cosmic event. Around midnight, I noticed a pair of headlights approaching in the distance. Panic, sharp and sudden, flared in my chest. No one ever came out this far. I considered packing up and running, but I couldn't leave the telescope mid-exposure. The vehicle drew closer, the engine humming quietly, before it finally stopped about 50 yards away. The lights cut out, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then a door creaked open. "I thought I might find you out here," a familiar, gravelly voice called out. It was Professor Davies. He walked toward me slowly, leaning on his cane, his eyes fixed on the massive expanse of stars above us. He didn't come too close, he knew my boundaries, but stopped just at the edge of my comfort zone. "The Smithsonian sent out a bulletin to the Regional Observation Network," he said softly, his voice full of wonder. "A new object. Reported by a Lily Evans from this very town." I had a feeling it wasn't a different Lily Evans. I stood there, frozen, clutching my notebook to my chest like a shield. I couldn't speak. The iron gate in my throat was locked tight. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the telescope. I nodded slowly, stepping aside. He leaned in, his aged eyes peering through the eyepiece for a long, silent minute. When he straightened up, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. It was a mix of pride and something that looked like profound relief. "It's magnificent, Lily. You've found a long-period comet. It's likely hasn't been in this part of the solar system for thousands of years." I just saw it," I managed to whisper. My voice sounded small and brittle in the vastness of the desert. "You didn't just see it," Davies corrected gently. "You observed it. You recognized it. And you had the courage to tell someone." He looked back at the sky. "Do you know what they're calling it in the bulletin? Comet Evans Davies?" "No. They're waiting for your final data to officially designate it. But the discovery credit, that belongs to you." The weight of it hit me all at once. My name, linked to that icy wanderer forever. The thought was both beautiful and horrifying. I don't want everyone to look at me," I said, the words finally tumbling out. "I just wanted to find it." Davies smiled, the moonlight catching the silver in his hair. "The stars don't care if you're shy, Lily. They've been watched by kings and hermits alike. But the world of men, they will want to hear from the person who saw the light in the dark." He checked his watch. "The Smithsonian is expecting your update by 3 a.m. They have a team in Chile waiting to turn a 4-meter mirror toward your coordinates. They're waiting on you, Lily." He left shortly after, leaving me alone with the wind and my telescope. I looked back through the eyepiece at the comet. It didn't look like a burden anymore. It looked like a path. I spent the next 2 hours perfecting my data, my hands finally steady. I knew that when I sent this email, there would be no going back. The phone would ring. People would want interviews. Scientists would want to talk. But as I looked at that fuzzy ball of light, I realized that for the first time in my life, I had something to say that was more important than my fear of saying it. 2. Revised. The drive home from the desert was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Usually, I enjoy the transition, the way the silence of the dunes slowly gives way to the flickering streetlights of town, but tonight, my car felt like a pressure cooker. My discovery was sitting in the passenger seat, tucked inside my messy notebook, and it felt heavy, like I was transporting a live wire. I kept glancing at the notebook, half expecting the coordinates to vanish or turn into gibberish. I kept telling myself, "Lily, you're an amateur. You probably saw a satellite or a reflection from a high-altitude balloon." But the deep, logical part of my brain, the part that had memorized the position of every major celestial object, knew exactly what I had seen. It was a visitor from the Oort cloud, and I was the only person on Earth who knew it was here. When I finally reached my small apartment, I didn't even take off my coat. I went straight to my desk and flipped open my laptop. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely type my password. I needed to be sure. I logged into the Minor Planet Center's database and cross-referenced the coordinates for the 10th time. Nothing. I checked the latest circulars from the International Astronomical Union. Nothing. The sky was officially empty in that specific sector. My heart did a slow, painful somersault against my ribs. This was it. The moment of truth. I opened a new browser tab and searched for how to report a new comet discovery. The instructions were clear, professional, and utterly terrifying. There was a specific format for the data, a specific email address, and a list of requirements that felt like an entrance exam for a club I wasn't cool enough to join. Provide precise astrometry. Include observer details, state equipment used. My eyes blurred as I read the words. Observer details. That meant me. Lily Evans. The girl who hides in the library stacks. The girl who hasn't made eye contact with her neighbor in 3 years. If I sent this data, I wouldn't be invisible anymore. I spent the next 3 hours in a state of hyper-focused panic. I cleaned up my notes, double-checked my calculations using 3 different methods, and even tried to enhance the grainy photos I'd taken with my phone through the eyepiece. They weren't great, but you could clearly see the coma, that fuzzy, ethereal envelope of gas and dust that separates a comet from a boring old asteroid. Every time I reached for the compose button on my email, I pulled back. My shyness wasn't just a quiet voice. It was a physical wall. It whispered to me, what if you're wrong? What if they laugh at you? What if they reply and ask to do a video call? That last thought was the worst. I imagined a stern-faced scientist on a screen, asking me complicated questions while I sat there, frozen and stuttering, with my laundry drying in the background. I could almost feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the way it always does when the spotlight is on me. I closed my laptop and walked to the window. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, turning the desert sky into a bruise-colored purple. I thought about the comet out there, hurtling through the vacuum, cold and ancient. It had traveled billions of miles just to be seen, and here I was, too afraid to hit a button. It's not about you, Lily, I whispered to the empty room. It's about the science. It's a trick I try to play on myself sometimes, trying to pretend I don't exist so I can get things done. I went back to the desk, opened the laptop, and stared at the draft. I had written it very formally, leaving out any hint of my personality. I didn't mention that I discovered it while sitting in a folding chair eating a granola bar. I just presented the numbers. Right ascension, for hours 22 minutes and 15 seconds. Declination, plus 15 degrees 31 minutes 2 seconds. I took a deep breath, held it until my chest felt like it might burst, and clicked send. The silence that followed was deafening. I expected something to happen immediately, a siren, a flash of light, an instant reply, but nothing happened. Just the hum of my refrigerator and the distant sound of a neighbor's car. Starting up. I collapsed onto my bed, still wearing my hiking boots, and fell into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of giant, icy rocks chasing me through library aisles. By the time I drove back from the desert after Professor Davies' visit, the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon. My eyes were gritty with exhaustion, but my mind was vibrating. I had sent the follow-up data. I had clicked send on the second, more detailed report, and this time, the weight of the action felt different. It wasn't just a shot in the dark anymore. It was a conversation. I was officially part of a global chain of events. The first thing I did when I got home was check my email. There were already 3 new messages. One was an automated confirmation, but the other 2 were from real people. One was from a researcher in Chile, Dr. Eris Thorne. He had attached a high-resolution image, a breathtakingly clear shot of my comet, taken by one of the world's most powerful telescopes. It looked like a silent, glowing ghost against the blackness. Excellent coordinates, Lily, he wrote. The trajectory is confirmed. We are announcing it to the Central Bureau for Astronomical Telegrams in 1 hour. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering. My coordinates. He used my name like I was a colleague, not a girl who rehearses saying thank you before the bus driver opens the door. But then, the second email made my blood run cold. It was from the library. Mrs. Gable wanted to let me know that a local news reporter had called the library asking for me. Apparently, the Regional Observation Network Davies mentioned wasn't as private as I had hoped. The panic that hit me was physical. I felt like I couldn't get enough air into my lungs. A reporter? News? That meant cameras. That meant people asking me how I felt. That meant my face on a screen, my voice, my shaky, uncertain voice, being broadcast into people's living rooms. I sat on my kitchen floor, my back against the fridge, and cried. Not out of sadness, but out of pure, overwhelming terror. Why couldn't they just take the data and leave me out of it? Why did the comet have to have a face? The phone started ringing. I didn't recognize the number, so I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. I turned it off and shoved it into a drawer. I felt like a fugitive in my own home. I spent the next 4 hours hiding in my darkened living room, the curtains drawn tight. I thought about the stars. They were so lucky. They could be seen by everyone, yet they remained millions of miles away, untouchable and silent. I wanted to be a star. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. I froze, holding my breath, praying they would go away. Lily? It's Professor Davies. I slowly stood up and opened the door just a crack. He looked concerned, holding a folded newspaper and a small paper bag that smelled like cinnamon rolls. I thought you might have the curtains drawn, he said gently. The world is a bit loud today, isn't it? He came in and sat at my small table. You can't hide forever, Lily. Not from this. It's a major discovery. They're going to name it Comet Evans. Do you understand what that means? For as long as humanity looks at the sky, your name will be part of the map. I don't want the name, I whispered, my voice thick with tears. I just wanted to find the comet. Why can't they just call it Comet 2026, X1 or something? Why does it have to be me? Davies looked at me with a profound sadness in his eyes. Because humans need stories, Lily. They don't just want to know that a rock is flying through space. They want to know who saw it first. They want to know about the girl who sat in the desert alone and noticed something the multi-million-dollar satellites missed. You are the story. But I'm not a story, I argued, my voice rising in frustration. I'm just me. I can't talk to them, Professor. I'll freeze. I'll look stupid. I'll ruin everything. He reached into the bag and handed me a cinnamon roll. You won't ruin the comet, Lily. It's made of ice and rock. It doesn't care about your public speaking skills. But you might ruin your chance to show other people that you don't have to be loud to be significant. Think about all the other quiet people out there. Think about the kids who hide in the library just like you did. Don't they deserve to see someone like them doing something extraordinary? That thought stayed with me long after he left. I spent the rest of the day looking at the photo Dr. Thorne had sent from Chile. The comet was so beautiful, so indifferent to my fear. It was just performing its celestial dance, exactly as the laws of physics demanded. I realized that if I didn't step up, someone else would tell my story for me. They would make me into something I wasn't. If I wanted to be represented accurately, I had to be the one to speak. I walked over to the drawer and pulled out my phone. I had 17 missed calls and 11 text messages. I took a deep, shuddering breath and called the first number on the list, the reporter from the local paper. My hand was shaking so much I almost dropped the phone, but when a woman's voice answered, I didn't hang up. Hello, the voice said. Is this Lily Evans? I closed my eyes, picturing the vast, silent desert and the cold, glowing comet. Yes, I said. My voice was small and it definitely trembled, but it was there. This is Lily. I'd like to talk about the comet. The interview was every bit as terrifying as I had imagined, but in a way that felt different from my usual. Panics. The reporter, a woman named Sarah, came to the library the next morning. I had insisted on the library because the familiar smell of old paper and the high ceilings made me feel like I had a layer of armor on. We sat in a small study corral in the back, far away from the main desk. I kept my hands tucked under my thighs so she wouldn't see them shaking. Sarah was kind, though. She didn't bring a big camera crew, just a small digital recorder and a notebook. So, Lily, she started, her voice low and respectful of the library's atmosphere. Tell me about the moment you realized you were looking at something no one else had ever seen. I looked down at the scratched wooden surface of the table. I tried to find the words, but the iron gate in my throat felt like it was beginning to rust shut. I took a breath, the way Professor Davies had taught me, focusing on the data. It was 11:42 p.m. I began, my voice barely a whisper. The sky was particularly stable, what we call good seeing. I was looking near the constellation Eridanus. I saw a fuzzy patch that didn't belong. It had a distinct coma. As I started talking about the technical details, the shyness didn't disappear, but it retreated to the background. When I talk about the stars, I'm not Lily the librarian anymore. I'm a witness. Sarah listened intently, her pen flying across the page. And how does it feel? Knowing that this object, this Comet Evans, is now named after you. The heat rushed to my face. It's overwhelming, I admit it. I didn't do it for the name. I just like the silence of the desert. I like that the stars don't ask anything of you. They just exist. I told her about my telescope, about the cold nights, and about how I felt more at home in the dark than in a crowded room. To my surprise, Sarah didn't look at me like I was a freak. She looked at me with a kind of wonder. The article came out the next day, and it wasn't the sensationalist piece I had feared. The headline read, "The Silent Watcher, Local Librarian Discovers New Comet." She had captured my shyness perfectly, describing me as someone who listens to the heartbeat of the universe while the rest of the world is shouting. For the first time, seeing my name in print didn't make me want to vanish. It made me feel understood. But the piece didn't last long. The local news story was picked up by a national wire service. By that afternoon, my inbox was overflowing with requests from morning talk shows, science podcasts, and even a documentary filmmaker. The library's quiet phone was ringing off the hook. Mrs. Gable looked like she was having the time of her life, acting as my unofficial press secretary, but I felt like I was being hunted. I spent most of the day hiding in the basement archives, organizing maps from the 1920s just to feel grounded. That evening, I got a call that I couldn't ignore. It was from the university's astronomy department. They weren't calling for an interview, they were calling to invite me to a symposium. They wanted me to be the keynote speaker for their amateur contributions to science night. My heart stopped. A keynote speaker? That meant a stage. That meant a microphone. That meant hundreds of eyes staring at me, waiting for me to be brilliant. I can't, I said into the phone, my voice cracking. I'm not a public speaker. I'm just a librarian. Lily, the voice on the other end said, it was Dr. Eris Thorne, the scientist from Chile. He had flown in for the event. You are the one who provided the most accurate early-stage astrometry we've seen in a decade. The students need to see that science isn't just about multi-billion-dollar satellites. It's about the person who stays awake when everyone else is asleep. Please. Just 10 minutes. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark of my apartment. I looked at my telescope in the corner. It looked lonely. I realized that my shyness was trying to protect me, but it was also trying to keep me small. It was telling me that my voice didn't matter, even when I had found something that spanned the entire solar system. I thought about what Professor Davies said about the other quiet people. If I stayed in the dark, I was telling them that they should stay in the dark too. I walked over to my desk and picked up a pen. I didn't write a speech. Instead, I started printing out the photos I had taken, the blurry ones from my phone and the crystal clear ones Dr. Thorne had sent. I realized I didn't have to be a performer. I just had to be a guide. I didn't need to talk about myself, I needed to talk about the light. I spent the whole night preparing not a speech, but a journey. I was going to take them to the desert with me. I was terrified, but for the first time. The excitement was starting to outweigh the dread. I was going to show them my comet. The night of the symposium arrived like a slow-moving storm. The university auditorium was a grand, intimidating space with wood-paneled walls and a stage that felt as wide as a football field. I stood in the wings, clutching a small USB drive like a lucky charm. My heart was a drum, beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I could hear the muffled chatter of the audience, hundreds of people, scientists, students, and curious locals, all gathered to hear the comic girl speak. I looked down at my shoes and wondered if I could just turn around, find a side exit, and keep walking until I reached the desert. "You're breathing too fast, Lily," a soft voice said. I turned to see Professor Davies. He was dressed in a sharp blazer, looking more like the academic he used to be. He reached out and gently patted my shoulder. "Remember what we talked about? You aren't there to entertain them. You are there to tell them what you saw. The stars are the stars. They don't need you to be perfect. They just need you to be honest." "I feel like I'm going to faint," I whispered. My throat felt like it had been lined with sandpaper. What if I get up there and the words just vanish? "Then let them vanish," Davies said with a shrug. "Show the pictures. The universe speaks for itself. You're just the one holding the flashlight." A man with a clipboard signaled to me. It was time. As I walked out onto the stage, the bright spotlights blinded me for a second, which was actually a blessing. I couldn't see the individual faces in the crowd, just a vast, dark sea of silhouettes. The applause was loud, echoing off the high ceiling, and it felt like a physical wave pushing against me. I reached the podium and stood there for a long, agonizing moment of silence. The iron gate in my throat was locked tight. I looked out into the darkness, and for a second, the panic nearly won. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, the familiar prickle of tears in my eyes. Then I looked at the monitor in front of me. I clicked the button, and the first slide appeared on the giant screen behind me. It was the very first photo I had taken, the blurry, grainy image from my phone through the telescope eyepiece. I took a deep breath, and suddenly, I wasn't in an auditorium anymore. I was back in the desert. I could almost feel the cold wind on my face and smell the scent of dry sage. "I found this at 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday," I said. My voice was quiet, and it definitely wavered, but it carried through the microphone. I wasn't looking for fame. I wasn't even looking for a comet. I was just looking for a bit of quiet. I started to describe the night. I talked about the coordinates, the way the light looked different from a satellite, and the way my heart skipped when I realized it was moving. I didn't try to use big, flowery words. I spoke the way I speak to the stars, simply and with a kind of hushed reverence. I showed the high-resolution images from Chile, explaining the chemical composition of the tail, the icy nucleus, and the ancient journey this object had taken. As I talked, something strange happened. The audience disappeared. The stage disappeared. It was just me and the comet. I realized that my shyness wasn't a barrier in this moment, it was an advantage. Because I had spent so much time observing and so little time talking, I had noticed things others might have missed. I talked about the specific hue of the coma, the subtle fluctuations in its brightness. I wasn't performing, I was sharing a secret. When I finished, I didn't know how long I had been talking. I realized I was smiling. I looked at the dark sea of people and said, "The universe is very big, and it can make you feel very small. But being small isn't the same as being invisible. Sometimes, it's the quietest observers who see the most." The silence that followed was absolute. For a heartbeat, I thought I had failed. I thought they were disappointed that I hadn't been more dynamic. But then, the applause started. It wasn't the polite clap from earlier, it was a roar. People stood up. I saw Dr. Thorne in the front row, nodding with a look of genuine respect. I saw Professor Davies, his eyes glistening with pride. I stepped away from the podium, my legs feeling like jelly, and walked back into the wings. I leaned against the wall and let out a long, shaky breath. I had done it. I had spoken my truth in front of hundreds of people, and I hadn't crumbled. I was still Lily, and I was still shy, but the wall wasn't a prison anymore. It was just a door that I had finally learned how to open. The days following the symposium were like waking up in a different dimension. The local library, usually my silent fortress, had become a hub of quiet excitement. People didn't just come in for books anymore. They came to see the comic girl. But something had shifted in me. Instead of ducking into the basement archives at the first sign of a stranger, I found myself staying at the front desk. When a young girl, no older than 10, walked up to me with a shy, gap-toothed smile and asked if I really discovered a star, I didn't stumble over my words. I bent down, looked her in the eye, and said it was a comet, actually a dirty snowball from the edge of the universe. And if you know where to look, you can see it too. The most profound change, however, happened within the walls of my own apartment. The phone still rang, and the emails still flooded in, but they no longer felt like threats. I had hired a part-time assistant, a college student named Mark who was as obsessed with astrophysics as I was, to handle the media requests. He became my buffer, my human shield, allowing me to focus on what actually mattered. I realized that being a leader in my field didn't mean I had to be the loudest voice on television. It meant I had to be the most reliable source of truth for the science. One evening, about a month after the discovery, Professor Davies invited me to the university's observatory. It was a clear, crisp night, the kind that makes the stars look like they're close enough to touch. We stood on the observation deck, the massive dome open to the heavens. The telescope was pointed at a specific coordinate, the final visible position of Comet Evans before it began its long journey back into the outer reaches of the solar system. "It's heading out," Davies said, his voice a soft rasp in the cool night air. "It won't be back for another 4,000 years. By then, everything we know will be dust, but your name will still be attached to it." I looked through the eyepiece one last time. The comet was fainter now, a delicate, ghostly smudge retreating into the infinite black. I didn't feel the same frantic need to hold on to it that I had felt in the beginning. I felt a sense of peace. I had played my part. I had been the witness the universe needed at that exact moment. I used to think my shyness was a cage, I said, not taking my eye off the lens. I thought it was a defect that kept me from being a real person. But out here, I realize it was just my way of listening. The world is so noisy, Professor. Everyone is so busy trying to be heard that they forget to hear. Davies nodded slowly. The stars are the ultimate introverts, Lily. They burn with an incredible intensity, but they do it in total silence. You've learned to speak their language. As the comet finally faded from view, leaving me with nothing but the familiar map of the constellations, I felt a strange sense of closure. My discovery had changed my life, but it hadn't changed who I was. I was still the girl who loved the smell of old books. I was still the girl who preferred tea to cocktails and silence to small talk. But I was also the girl who had stood on a stage and told hundreds of people that their voices mattered, even if they were whispers. I walked back to my car, the desert wind tugging at my hair. I looked up at the Milky Way, sprawling across the sky like a spilled bottle of silver ink. I wasn't afraid of the vastness anymore. I wasn't afraid of the people who lived under it. I knew that tomorrow I would go back to the library, I would organize the science section, and I would help people find the stories they were looking for. And when the sun went down, I would drive back out to the dunes, set up my telescope, and wait for the next secret the universe decided to share. My name is Lily Evans. I am an astronomer, a librarian, and a quiet observer. I used to be a ghost, but now I am the wind. You might not always see me, but if you look at the stars, you'll know I'm there, watching, listening, and waiting for the light.